Okay.
Good afternoon. Notice Brite Divinity School students, staff and faculty, and other community friends. And it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Wil Gafney, this year's Jablonowski Lecture. Dr. Gafney's first lecture, titled How We Hear Scripture, Lectionaries and Translations, was presented yesterday at St. Stephen's Presbyterian Church. Here I ask that we recognize the presence of our President, Dr. Noel Williams, the pastor of St. Stephen's Presbyterian Church, Dr. Prefixes, Brite trustee, Dr. Bill Curtis, whose family is responsible for endowing lectureship in honor of Reverend Wil Jablonowski, who served at St. Stephen's as pastor for 39 years. For those among us who might not yet know, Dr. Gafney is the Right Reverend Sandy Hulsey Professor of Hebrew Bible at this institution. Dr. Gafney came to Brite from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia in 2014, and she has had a stellar career as teacher, scholar, pastor, public theologian, and activist. At Brite, Dr. Gafney is very highly regarded in her field by students and faculty peers alike, as by example she challenges all to bring their best minds and spirits to the endeavor of teaching and learning. You should know that in 2020, she received the prestigious Society for Biblical Literature's Outstanding Mentor Award. She's also an important player in the processes of joint governance at Brite, and she provides important leadership that is vital in this period when the challenges in theological education require creativity and informed risk-taking. Along with numerous articles for academic peer-reviewed journals and for other ecclesial and public outlets, Dr. Gafney has authored or co-authored 7 volumes. I think she's best known for the text Womanist Midrash, a reintroduction to the women of the Torah and throne. This work has become a required text in seminaries and divinity schools, as well as assigned reading in undergraduate courses in religion around the United States, and is utilized in graduate and continuing education in the Americas, the Caribbean, the UK, France, Germany, Pacifica, Israel, and Palestine, and is congregational reading in the United States, Canada, the UK, France, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands in both Jewish and Christian congregational and academic spheres. That said, Dr. Gafney's more recent publications are increasing awareness of her scholarly power and her religious and ethical commitments in an even wider range of settings. These publications are years A and W of her lectionary series, a women's lectionary for the whole church. Even as we explore the wisdom in these volumes, I encourage us to prepare ourselves for the 2 volumes to come that will complete this lectionary series. This afternoon, I'm looking forward to the deepened insight to be gained into the character of the works of Dr. Gafney that are presently available to us. Glimpses into the challenging work that informs such texts and other works to come, and exposure to the intriguing, challenging process of biblical interpretation. With the confidence that you are equally expectant, I invite you to receive Reverend Dr. Wil Gafney as she lectures on the theme, Invisible Biblical Interpretation, the work behind the words. Dr. Gafney.
Thank you, Dean Miller, and thanks again to the community at St. Stephen and the Jablonowski Committee for inviting me, and for those of you who've been with us these 2 days, including a select number who have been at every single event, from the Sunday school to the sermon to the first lecture to the second lecture. Great is your reward in my kingdom. Translation matters. Translation is the only means non-Hebrew readers have to access the scriptures of Israel in their own tongues. Yet the act of translation and the principles that govern an individual translation are frequently invisible to many readers, save for express preferences for one translation of the Bible over another. Even then, the preference is often based on non-scholarly criteria. What the text sounds like, how familiar it is, how it corresponds to cherished, previously held beliefs about what a text ought to say, or even a belief that only one translation of the Bible is authoritative. Original biblical translation is a regularly occurring feature of biblical scholarship, but it frequently appears without any reflection, even when it appears with volumes of voluminous footnotes. Because translation is perhaps the first layer of biblical interpretation, though a similar argument could be made for text selection, frequently consumed without notice by the reader, I find it important to reflect on how and why I translate the way I do. And so you have two handouts right now. One is a bullet point list that summarizes my broad principles of translation, some of the broader principles of translation from the Women's Lectionary. And we'll come back to that one. The other is an example for why we need to talk about translation, not just in the academy, but in the congregation. So I invite you to look at the page with Psalm 68 on it, one line from it. And depending on whether the psalm is numbered in Hebrew and subsequent Jewish publications, or it's numbered in English and other secondary language Christian publications, the numbering of the Psalms, like the numbering of a number of biblical passages, is going to be different. So I invite you to start with Wycliffe there, because from Wycliffe down, all of those are translations that are coming from the Hebrew text. The NETS is coming from the Septuagint, the Greek version of the First Testament, and I'll get there in a moment. God speaks. Somebody is proclaiming good news, which, depending on your translation, might be rendered as gospel, and indeed, both the Hebrew word that underlies that and the Greek word that underlies that are the philological roots of the gospel preaching endeavor, the social and cultural spreading of good news in ancient Israel, such as victory after combat. In the Geneva Bible, the Geneva Bishop Bibles were the Bibles that some of the earliest European immigrants brought to this land, because King James was too flashy, too fancy, and not well adopted at that point. In the Geneva Bible, all of a sudden you find women in the middle of the verse. No women in King James. In the NRSV, in fine print, at the very, very bottom of the page, you find what is presented as an alternative, or the Company of Women. The old RSV doesn't even have that fine print. The Common English Bible, Gracious the Women, the Jewish Publication Society has them back in. And then when I translate, not only do I make them present, but I also use a different set of language around the word Lord, representing God's name. So depending on what Bible you pull off the shelf, you might not know that this verse that forms the basis for a well-regarded piece of music in Handel's Messiah, the line about the company of preachers, is about women and only women preachers, only women proclaiming the gospel. Translation matters. Who translates matters. It's not as simple as when there are women on the committees, this gets pulled out. It's more complicated than that, but it is absolutely clear that if women are never in any of these rooms, we're not going to see this anywhere. My journey in translation. Translation has been visible to me for a very long time. I saw it in the corners of my eyes before I ever went to divinity school or pursued theological education. Indeed, I tried to teach myself Hebrew before I even recognized that there was a call in my life into teaching and preaching pastoral and priestly ministry. In high school, I read the scriptures in Latin and French, but preferred the French and carried it with me through and into college. I was unsatisfied with English translations and had a giant parallel Bible with 4, and I might have had one with 6 translations of varying quality, and was still unsatisfied. I was introduced to the NRSV in college and found it a great improvement over everything in my collection, but it still wasn't quite enough. In 2005, I presented the first paper articulating my scholarly voice in the African American Biblical Hermeneutics section of the Society for Biblical Literature annual meeting. And in good scholarly form, I had a ridiculously long title, including a hopefully provocative subtitle, Hearing the Word, Translation Matters, a film womanist exploration of translation theory and practice for proclamation and worship. I identify this paper as the first in my voice because I previously substituted for someone on a book panel and thus had my first allegedly vetted first paper box checked. Now this is some inside baseball for the learned societies. In the Society of Biblical Literature and American Academy of Religion, when you are a first-time presenter, which generally means a very junior faculty member or a graduate student, you have to submit your whole paper in way early so someone can read it and vet it. Because I substituted on that panel, I just showed up and gave my paper. So I am, and some of you are unsurprised, completely unvetted and unmoderated. In fact, I may write a memoir, unchecked and unvetted. So this paper then was me proposing a paper of my own thoughts that suited the topic without anyone interfering. The foundation of my paper and rationale for my ongoing interest in translation was that, and I'm quoting from that first paper, my experience as a Hebrew biblical scholar has demonstrated that all of the published translations of the biblical text that I have encountered in the context of worship have male translators. KJV, NIV, NASB, New American Standard Bible, New English Bible, Jerusalem Bible, New Jerusalem Bible, NRSV, the Net Bible, the Message, and one of my favorites, Everett Fox's. And I have an erratum. This paper is now being published for a 3rd time. I had missed the tiny representation of women in some of these, although technically I wasn't wrong because I didn't say all male, but surely that's the implication. So, Catherine Dube Sackenfeld would later tell me the story of how the Hebrew Bible women got together and would not let the men on the NRSV translation committee put just one token woman. They called each other and told each other nobody say yes until they agreed to put all of us, which is how you get 3 women on the Hebrew Bible in the NRSV, but you only get 1 woman in New Testament. Testament, because I'm guessing either that didn't happen or there were not enough women with Ph.D.s at that point for that to have been feasible. So the numbers that I've been able to find more recently are in the NIV, there have been 2 women out of 13 translators, and that pattern repeated a couple of times with Janine Brown and Sandra Richter currently, and Habila Dharam Raj and Karen Jobs previously. The CEB, 20 women out of 120 translators, but including for the first time a woman of color. There were a number of men of color on the CEB. I told you the story of the NRSV, and the new NRSV is being revised currently. There are 3 Black women working on the revision of the New Testament. Our neighbor, Dr. Margaret Amers, who's dean at the Austin Presbyterian Seminary, and Dr. Shively Smith and Mitzi Smith. Now here's the heart of that paper, and it's an argument and question that I'm still making and asking. What might the gathered people of God hear if Black women translate the scriptures with attention to gender, human and divine, and attention to the cultural context and implications of the text? Now, this is more than a rhetorical question, because when I preach, the gathered people of God hear a Black feminist translation of the sacred text, whether they know it or not. And as an Episcopalian, I translate all of the assigned lectionary texts every time I stand behind the sacred text. I have really enjoyed going back to this paper and seeing the genesis of the lectionary project, even here, when I didn't know that it was on the way. The present study, this past study, responds to that question with a brief discussion of my translation practices, followed by my own feminist translations of selected texts framed in African-American religious discourse. I would revise those translation principles for Womanist Midrash, in which I'll address next, and then I revisit them finally for the Women's Lectionary for the whole church. And before we talk about that bulletin list, I want you to see what it looks like. And so I'm going to ask my student to pass out the translation of Isaiah 54 that serves as the first reading for Advent 2 in year A, the year that focuses on Matthew of the lectionary. And I am going to invite those of you who are present to read, but because we have people who are online, I am also going to read. So listen and read with me, or read on your own, but we'll spend a little bit of time with this. Sing, childless woman, never given birth woman. Woman, break out a song and rejoice, woman, never in labor woman. For the children of the devastated woman, for more are the children of the devastated woman than the children of the espoused woman, says the giver of life. Woman, expand the place of your tent, woman, and the curtains of your sanctuary, woman, extend them. Do not hold back, woman. Woman, lengthen your ropes, woman, and woman, secure your stakes, woman. For left and right you will break through, woman, and your seed, woman, will inherit nations, and in devastated cities they will dwell. Do not fear, woman, for you will not be ashamed, woman. Do not feel humiliated, woman, for you will not be disgraced, woman. For the shame of your youth, woman, you will forget, woman. And the stigma of your widowhood, woman, you will never remember, woman. For your spouse, woman, is the one who made you, woman. The sovereign commander of winged warriors is God's name. The Holy One of Israel will redeem you, woman, who is called God of all the earth. For like a wife abandoned and abject in spirit, the faithful God has called you, woman, for you were a rejected young bride, says your God, woman. For brief space I abandoned you, woman, but in great mother love I will gather you, woman. For a minute I hid my face briefly from you, woman, but in eternally bonded love I will mother love you, woman. Your Redeemer, woman, has spoken. Virtually every line of this magnificent poem contains feminine singular prefixes and suffixes. There are feminine singular nouns, feminine singular adjectives, feminine singular imperatives, feminine singular participles, and verb stems from Cal to Hippo, all feminine singular. In order to preserve the form of this piece in translation, I used the word woman for each place in which a feminine marker appeared in the text that would be invisible to someone reading in English. One of my white male students told me that he found my translation repetitive and redundant. I asked him to propose an argument for suppressing the female gender identity of God's conversation partner in an androcentric canon that regularly marginalizes women and silences their voices. He did not. He could not. Each verse in Isaiah 54 has at least 2 feminine markers, and some have as many as 8, with one exception. In one of God's speeches, occurring in verse 16, God speaks in the first person without gender. This is more than an exercise in the feminine grammar of biblical Hebrew poetry. It's a poem of what I like to call mother tongue, the early name for woman's midrash. Using tender images of maternal love, God communicates through the prophet her deep and abiding love for her people, particularly her daughters. Now, as a result of the demographics of the Guild, the voice of authority in biblical translation has most often been a white, Gentile male voice, particularly in Christian or Christian-adjacent contexts where Jewish interpretation of the Hebrew Bible has not been regarded as authoritative. When I wrote Womanist Midrash, I crafted a translator's preface that the publisher relegated to the appendices to avoid scaring the readers without academic training. I asked the question, who translates God's words and how, and then began to answer. Gender matters. Gender matters in the text, in the world of the text, and in the world of the translator. Gender matters to me and to countless number of women, hearers, and readers of the biblical text for whom it is scripture. Gender matters significantly to those who have been and are marginalized because of gender, especially when it's done in the name of God appealing to the scriptures. And gender matters to men. Gender matters to hearers and readers of the scriptures who are privileged to share the gender of the dominant portrayal of God, the majority of biblical characters, the majority of biblical characters who have speaking parts, the majority of translators of biblical texts, and the majority of the interpreters of biblical texts. Because biblical Hebrew is a gendered language, translation of the scriptures has feminist and womanist and masculinist and androcentric implications. The linguistic gendering means that every noun and adjective in the overwhelming majority of verb forms in Hebrew Bible are either feminine or masculine. There are also common forms that include both genders. Older grammatical resources identify some of these as masculine plural, leading to generations of gender-based translation distortion. Because it is quite common that groups of people are regularly described with a common plural form, again, formerly called, and still in some places called masculine plural, that is used both for all male gender groups and mixed gender groups, no matter how many, what type of person is there. So you can have a group with 99 women and 1 man, and it would use the same common form that it does if it's all men or if it's 50-50. And there's some grammars that will refer to all of those as masculine plural, eliminating the presence of women in the grammar. In short, there is no neuter gender in Hebrew as there is in Greek and English. So this body of work, the lectionary, builds on those 2 previous bodies of work, and it culminates in the translations that you have before you and the list of some of my translation principles. So I'd like to go to the list of principles, talk about that, and then go back to the readings for Advent. So one of the things that I do as a product of feminism, womanism, post-colonial scholarship, and liberationist movement is identify myself in the world. and identify the way in which my work is related to who I am as a person. So that means when I am translating something and I'm doing something in a way that is significantly at odds with some of my colleagues in the field, I will leave the reader a note about it and I will explain it. Not defend it, not argue it, but explain it. I don't write with the voice of God, although some of my students might disagree with that. When material from the First Testament comes into the Second Testament or subsequent testament, as occasionally happens with the canonical text, I place that in italics so it's easy for the reader to recognize. But here's where my translation really comes into its own in this project. I use the language of gender expansive translation, which means I am taking those plurals that I just discussed and expanding them so that the reader and hearer can have present for them the people that constitute the reader. So instead of saying the Israelites left Egypt, I'll say the women, children, and men of Israel left. And if we're talking about the Canaanites, instead of simply saying that Joshua slaughtered the Canaanites, naming that Joshua slaughtered the women, children, and men of Canaan makes us pause a little bit, makes us not as easy to dismiss the Canaanites as a group of strange and foreign to be dispensed with, but wrestles with the fact that they are people, their children, their infants. I use maternal genealogical information. Jesus is the son of Bathsheba, and in some places the son of David and Bathsheba, the God of Jacob, God of Rebekah's lineage. When it's adding something to the text, it will be there in brackets as an option for the reader. But otherwise, it's noted in the text notes that follow the readings, and you'll be able to see those text notes and the preaching commentary in just a moment. Because so many people pray the Psalms and do not hear the fullness of God as God is articulated in the scriptures, where both masculine and feminine language is used and feminine and masculine imagery is used, I made the decision to make the Psalm a repository of feminine God language, so that whenever there's a pronoun used, I use the feminine one, so that people who pray the Psalms will have that experience of reading, hearing, and praying the Psalms consistently in feminine language. I also offer the reader, and particularly liturgists, options for how to include all of these in worship. Some congregations have just adopted the whole thing. Some have adopted it for a liturgical season. Some might substitute the NRSV psalm. Some are printing one set of readings and reading another set of readings aloud. Some are using their traditional lectionary readings and then using these readings in their text and study group. I welcome all of those that have made many of those suggestions. In terms of the ways in which we name God, I avoid the slaveholding title Lord, because that is exactly what it is in the biblical text. It's a title that's used for male slaveholding people, and like all divine titles, it's a title that rises from humanity to divinity. And following the example of Rabbi Dr. Joel Rosenberg, who translated the Psalms for the Kol HaNeshama Siddur, the prayer book of Reconstructing Judaism, I use the kind of linguistic expression that you saw in the Psalm 68 piece, the ark of safety. He used the fount of life, the wisdom of the ages. And that draws on an older rabbinic practice of substituting names of reverence for the divine name, like Hashem, the name Hamakom, which in turn draws on the textual notes in the Hebrew Bible, where instead of attempting to pronounce the most holy name, we substitute with the word Adonai in some cases, which means Lord. That's how we got it into English, but in other cases with Elohim. So there's this long tradition of substitutions because we do not pronounce the divine name. In terms of the New Testament, I use father language specifically when it's about the fathering and fatherhood and sonship of the relationship between Jesus and God. In other places, I use other language, like creator. In the parables about the sparrow, I use provider. And in terms of God's space, where God is, I don't really believe that God is running any kind of government, not a monarchical government, not a plutocratic government. That the kingdom language is about majesty, but it's not about a small monarchy trying to grow into a bigger monarchy, trying to grow up into an empire, which is what monarchies were and did in ancient world. So some places I use language like reign and realm, with which you may be familiar, but more often I've been thinking about the word majesty because it occurs, and I'm sure our colleague Dr. Williams will tell me exactly where it occurs, but I remember coming across it in Greek and Hebrews, and recognizing that it was a feminine noun and playing with it a little bit, and after settling on it, I decided that that expresses what I think about God's face. So it's not that God, little children, I long to give you the kingdom, a system of government, dukes and princesses and a whole Disney setup, but I want to give you the majesty of my undying parent. That's what it's about. So I use that. I use Judeans rather than Jews in some places. I do not erase Jews and Judaism, as is a legitimate concern from some Jewish scholars and voices. There are places where I say the other Jews. But I recognize that the specific formulation that we have in the New Testament is often hostile in the text, often hostile in interpretation, and particularly hostile in the world. Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg says, nothing good ever happens when people say the Jews, right? It's the way many black folk feel about the blacks. So I try to smooth that language out. In the same way, because blackness and darkness is racialized in this world that reads the text, where I'm writing primarily being read, and adds something that's profoundly negative in a way it's not intended, even when the darkness is just meteorological in the biblical text. I'm using language like gloom and shadow to not feed into the sort of enlightenment interpretation of the scriptures. And what may seem to be a reversal of my other practices, I'm taking the hard reading in terms of using the language of slave rather than servant, because people who were in those relationships, whether they were contractual for a period of time or long-lasting, in both testaments, had limited to no autonomy over their persons, their sexuality, their ability to reproduce with whom, or even whether they would be able to keep those children. That's not servitude. That is enslavement. So it makes it a hard reading, and I invite people who are using the lectionary to make a decision about whether they will preserve that language or go back to servant, but do so in conversation with their congregations. A final word about this language, and I invite you to turn to the Advent reading. I'll invite you to turn to the second page and take a look at the psalm and see how disimportant it is from our side of the street, the western side of the street, the modern side of the street, to read that first line, give praise, you slaves of the Most High. That language of enslavement was a basing language, it's self-abasing language. And it is something for those of us who are in the Atlantic basin and Caribbean basin to wrestle with how much the language of enslavement is normal in our scriptures and how much the slavocracy that was erected upon it is not rooted in misinterpretation, mistranslation, and misapplication of the text. That's something with which we must struggle. You can see in the large and small capital letters are places where your Bibles would have said the Lord. There is a practice in biblical scholarship of using those large and small letters so that however one translates it, people will know that the sacred meaning, tetragrammaton, is there. And at the end of the lectionaries, there is a lexicon of God names that are used in the lectionaries and some that are extra that the reader and hearer and liturgist and preacher might use in worship instruction. I point you to the text notes, a small one, and on the third page, which is page 6, under text notes, the second full paragraph, it's about 2 sentences, making the note of asking the question, who is the subject of this particular verb because of the characteristic of the Greek language, just in Hebrew language, and then inviting the reader to think about how we read it if it's Sarah versus how we read it if it's Abraham, and being explicit about my choice, given that grammatically it can go either way. I flip the coin and put my thumb on the female side of it and make it Sarah. And so for people who read it in Bibles where it's Abraham, how does that sound different? That's an opportunity for study. On the last page, you see an example of a kind of proofs and prompts. And again, in the second paragraph of that, I go right to the rhythm and challenge of Isaiah 54. If you use the word woman to evoke all the feminine suffixes that someone reading in Hebrew is going to hear over and over again, we don't have a way to do that in English without adding a word. And so those notes are there for you. So now a final word about gendered language. As a women's lectionary, this project specifically and intentionally makes women visible in these lectionary texts. This will inevitably seem strange to some hearers and readers. Some will find it welcome and a signifier of inclusion. Some will find it discordant, and I invite those to think deeply about what that discomfiture signifies. These responses may well be multiplied when reading and hearing the Psalms with feminine pronouns. And some will find the language in these volumes insufficiently inclusive, particularly with regard to non-binary and agender persons. While there is non-binary language for human and divine subjects, the purpose of this lectionary is to make women and girls more visible. Non-binary and inclusive language can obscure women and girls. The commitment to the visibility of women and girls is not in conflict or in competition with the commitment to the visibility of non-binary persons. This language, like all language, my language, is simply inadequate to express the fullness of God in and beyond the world, or even in human creation. Most simply, these translations seek to offer and extend the embrace of the scriptures to all who read and hear, that they might see and hear themselves in them and spoken to by them. Similarly, taking seriously that we are all created in the image of God, these translations seek to display a God in whose image we see ourselves reflected and reflecting. Thank you all.
Now we have opportunity to speak back to Professor Gafney. Questions primarily. I will just look for hands and guide you to Dr. Gafney. Yes, at the back.
So, have you considered doing the entire Bible?
I get that a lot, and I have not seriously considered it. I have simply said yes immediately. I mean, no immediately.
I heard a yes first.
You did hear yes. That was not Freudian. That was I ate really well and I needed a nap. This I do different translation styles for different projects, and so the translations in Womanists Midrash are a little different, and the translations in Daughters of Miriam are a little different. And so if I were to translate the Bible, all 80 books of the Bible, I probably need to translate some of those Enochs, because whatever reason the Episcopal Church uses one of the later Enochs to pull the angel Uriel up into the Feast of All Angels. See, it just gets big. But if I were to do that, and say I did it in this gender expansive format, that is such a lot of work that I don't know that it could be done before I left this earth. It would also mean spending a lot of time mucking about in places I do not wish to muck. Right now, I'm pouting a lot because I made the decision, because of a request by the Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan. Well, it wasn't a request, it was a question. Would either B or C go more or less sequentially through one of the Gospels? And I said, well, Mark is little, this is the time. So I am, ironically, other than translating Ruth and Jonah, which everybody who teaches Hebrew does, over and over again, reading with students, my first entire biblical book translation may be Mark, and that's not right, God, that was not my field. So when you take 52 Sundays a year, 16 chapters of Mark, they're running like 22, obnoxiously, 55. You break each chapter into 2 pieces, a couple of the long ones into 3 pieces, then you have special Sundays, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, whatever. That math pretty much ends up that you have stretched math Mark over the whole year. So there already are pieces I'm skipping. Jesus does a lot of teaching in the first 3 books. So, not every single parable is going to make it in. So that's going to help me get some of those 40 to 50 verse chapters into manageable pieces. But it does mean that year B is coming with a note that because of the attempt to get as much of the gospel in, those are going to be long gospel readings. They're going to be 12, 20, I'm trying to maintain a commitment not to go beyond 20 verses for a gospel reading. And of course, the lectors and clergy can, chop them where they will. But no, I have been asked, I've been asked on committees and projects where we thought and talked about it. I was not able to work with the new NRSV project. I'm doing commentary on the version of it that's coming out from Westminster Press, but I appreciate the question, and I really do not believe that is my call at this point in my life.
So if serious scholars, knowing all these ancient languages, can look at the same line and interpret it so differently, how much of that is, there really is a legitimate disagreement about what a word means versus how much is explicit bias? So
this is the complexity of language and identity in which multiple things can be true. So the expression B'nai Israel, which in some Bibles you might see as Israelites, or children of Israel, or even sons of Israel, none of those are grammatically wrong and will get you ticked off on a quiz, right? All of those are correct. And it's not wrong that I translate the women, children, and men of Israel. Sometimes, in the early days, because I was worried about critique, I would put dashes between them, which is another technical biblical thing to do, to say that all of these words are translated in one word. So I'm not saying the word woman is in there or the word children is in there. I'm saying this one word translates to, all the human mammals of Israel, right? And so all of those things are grammatically correct. Some of them are going to be more contextually correct. So for example, the sons of Israel are, and if they start naming dudes later, then sons is appropriate. But guess what? children is always appropriate, right? And so the choice to say, well, we know these are the patriarchs, they are men, we should just name them as men, that's not always about grammatical specificity. That's about gender domination, because it is equally correct to say to someone, even when you know the makeup of little people in the household, how many children do you have now? How many sons do you have now? Like, neither of those questions is incorrect. Notice I said someone you know, like a lot of people. Right? So it is what is socially constructed around it. Why is it essential that those people be named as men? What does that mean? Who is benefiting from it? And on the other side, what is lost when we take the mankind approach to the Bible? Well, it just all means human. We can just say the humans. We can just say the people. And when we do that, then generations of women and girls and non-binary folk have never heard themselves. So men have never not heard themselves as the central perspectival subject in everything. The Bible speaks easily and clearly to men. The degree to which it speaks to women is more mediated by who translates it how, and what text a pastor or preacher preaches, and how they preach it. Because you can do the open the pages, stick your finger in, and find a view, right? That might not work with women or children or people who don't correspond to the Bible's mostly binary way of constructing gender. So several things can be grammatically correct, and only some of the people on the translating tables are analyzing and being honest about the political implications of what they're doing. So if people are saying, well, it was just right, it's men. They're not wrong that it means men, but they're not being honest about why that's so important and what that has accomplished in the world that reads, hears, and translates the text.
Question, as you've shared on your scholarship in Womanist Midrash and the lectionaries in a range of places, I'm sure, what has been the response of women, generally speaking, and men, generally speaking, if that's an appropriate question to ask? So, from the beginning, women and non-binary, identified non-binary people were on it. They were some of the people saying, for people who were at the event yesterday, and people, Dr. Williams heard the paper at SBL, that when I first said, oh, somebody ought to do this, they're like, yes, we should do it. Those were women and identified non-binary people. So from the beginning, they were there in a racially diverse cloud. So those are the ride or dies. As it began to take shape, and people in the social media world, and then eventually, as I was physically going to places and engaging people, conversations with men, and here I want to say cis-het men. I'll come back to gay men, transphobe, other non-binary, agender people, but so cis-het men. I found that white men also jumped on it with both feet, to my surprise. I honestly was waiting for the liturgical police, and I figured that would come from the Episcopal Church, because we're good about that kind of thing, and I a couple of Lutherans and Presbyterians would have to say. But now there may be a chat room where they're setting me on fire in effigy, but people who follow me know that trolls don't hesitate to knock on my door and occasionally call my boss and, do all that stuff. And I have not gotten any of that liturgical reason. So I got tremendous support from white men, both in the kind of churches that traditionally use a lectionary, but also the evangelical community, and particularly in the South. They want a way to preach a structured year. They want a project that they can trust in terms of the scholarship. They want to upend some gender norms, and so
there are just huge study groups of large and megachurch pastors doing that. A disappointment for me has been that among the Black men who have adopted, the Black men who adopted at the lowest rate are Black men in the Episcopal Anglican tradition. Particularly in the US, I've got more Black international Anglican adoption. But Black men who are in other Protestant traditions are using it for study, reading, devotion, all kinds of things. In terms of gay men, trans women men, femme gay men, in my consultations, I partnered with All Saints Church Pasadena, and we set up a group with those contours so that I could hear from people how they were experiencing the word from their place of embodiment. And so that was the push to get more non-binary language in there and be clear about why I'm doing a project on women in a post-gender world, right, or an increasingly post-gender world. And so we talked about how if you move from father to creator, then again, you never heard mother. And so you have, women and girls don't have that experience. So maybe this is a transitory project, and then the next project will be more sufficiently non-binary, and then I'm writing myself into obscurity, and someone who follows me, maybe a student will do another project. I'm fine with being built upon. But I think developmentally, this is an important step, because what we know about gender-neutral language is while people may smirk about creator, redeemer, sustainer, it doesn't trouble them the way mother does, right? And which means that their God image in their head, the male image has not been disrupted because creator and redeemer doesn't trouble them. It's when there's explicit feminine language, the womb of life. The degree to which that troubles them is the degree to which we still have to dethrone the male God. And so that is one of the aims of this project.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, Catherine.
Any questions or comments? Open a little bit to comments, and because we're leaving soon.
Well,
Okay, you go first.
I was just going to say, breath just comes into my life in the room. I just wish I had met you years ago.
Thank you.
Dr. Williams, Jeff.
My good question was around your and I'd like to hear you use it a little bit more around how you think about the basileia today, or the kingdom of reign. Because I have sometimes difficulty thinking about how to actually think through how to appropriately translate beyond kingdom. Kingdom doesn't do the work.
Right.
And reign still has some of those echoes of domination. So I enjoyed what you have in your translation, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about how do you work through thinking with that term?
Trying to decide what are the essential components. So that's why I started talking about God's space, that it's about where God is and not bureaucratic functions that God does. You know, like send out somebody to negotiate with the neighbors, or send out somebody to capture the East Field, or send somebody to build up a new wall. Like all the things that monarchies do, like it was about none of that. It was definitely about showing God is big and important and in control. But it's sort of taking, you know, a human Lego set and like then building it out of cedar wood. It's like, you're like me, but just bigger. I'm a king and you're a king, right? We're all kings. So what are the things that Jesus is saying about it? Because he's not doing the bureaucratic stuff. Even later when you get things about either judging the 12 tribes of Israel or doing justice for the 12 tribes of Israel, which changes that translation. So I tried to think it's about God's space, but the idea of majesty that's still associated with reigning and ruling, I don't know that we can ever take that out because that's such a core piece. I honestly looked at Commonwealth, because I liked how it sounded in my head. Then I looked up what a Commonwealth was and how it works. I was like, actually, I don't really think that's bad. And I don't know that we actually have a governing structure in the English-speaking world that makes sense. So, you know, it might be like Gian Hadea talks about when people try to translate the scriptures to some of the Pacifica languages, all of the reference points were wrong. Like there were no sheep, and so you know, there were these hilarious things about, well, you know, Jesus is the great wild boar pig herder. That really, you know, like who would hurt wild boars? And, you know, pigs are not kosher, right? So they were just grasping at trying to make these things relatable. And so a community that he was with said, let's throw that all out. What is an example of the God who, you know, gathers you in, welcomes you? And it was like, you know, God is a warm fire on the beach welcoming you to his home, right? None of that's in Greek, but it gets at it. So I'm wondering if we need to do something like that, find an image that doesn't actually correspond to any of the words, which is what the New Zealand prayer book does. It doesn't translate the English prayer book. It gives a parallel liturgy drawing on language, culture, and tradition. So I just don't know that we can get a word out of the philology that we have there that encapsulates the concept and doesn't become proto-colonial and imperial.
So a round of applause as we close. Thanks to the endowers of the Jablonowski Lectureship, St. Stephen Presbyterian Church, President Williams, and most of all, Professor Gafney, you have excited our minds, you have stirred our consciousnesses and our consciences. And I hope that we all will be going out to be adventurous in the field that has been opened up to us in consultation with the experts. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.